So let's briefly talk about how the research that you've just read applies to Ernest Hemingway's very first novel, The Sun Also Rises. First, I just want to give a little bit of background information just because I thought it was interesting. That The Sun Also Rises went through a couple of renditions for the title. One of them was Two Lie Together, the other, River to the Sea, and the final one was The Old Leaven. And also, Jake Barnes's names were initially in like the first couple of drafts, either him or Ernie. Um, and although this isn't a completely autobiographical novel, we can see Ernest Hemingway's kind of deep connection with Jake Barnes, especially in that we know that Jake Barnes lived in Paris just like Hemingway did, went to the Pamplona Festival, went fishing just like Hemingway loved to do and did, along with the group of expatriates that Hemingway was friends with when he was out in Paris, as well as Jake Barnes having a very similar lost generation expatriate friend group. However, obviously, the final iteration of the protagonist's name was Jake Barnes. So the Lost Generation. First, I want to talk about how Jake Barnes kind of fits into this idea. He fits into it because not only was he an expatriate, but he also came of age during World War I, and having not only served in the war, but also been physically affected by it, with this ailment of impotence. Though he very, very rarely refers to this impotence, it actually affects and is the greatest conflict of the novel, with his relationship with Lady Brett Ashley. And we see it haunting him throughout. They're both inherent. Lady Brett Ashley and Jake Barnes are inherently drawn to one another, but recognize that their relationship can go no further than this platonic love because of his injury in the war. So World War I, just like with The Lost Generation, is a ghost that follows him throughout the novel. However, just because he falls within the category of The Lost Generation with his service in the war, him expatriating, does it imply that he's morally bankrupt and wandering? And I'd definitely like to discuss this as a whole class rather than just kind of providing my own thoughts on this. So just like save this in your brain for Monday. On the other hand, we also see Robert Cohn, who serves as a foil not only to Jake Barnes, but also all the other men who in this novel have served in the war. Robert hasn't. And because of that, though he's an expatriate, he's not really a part of this lost generation. It also seems that because of his absence from the war, unlike the rest of the characters, he still clings on to the pre-war ideals, what it means to be a man or a gentleman. When he sleeps with Brett in San Sebastian, he cannot help but cling to the idea that it means more than just some simple fling, and becomes almost a pseudo stalker of her throughout the rest of the novel. Sex isn't just sex, it has a lot of emotional meaning, which, according to this novel, is a very pre war idea. Um, he also believes that because of it, he has some deeper claim or connection to her than the others. And at the very beginning of the novel, he is a believer that, quote, the splendid imaginary amorous adventures, and end quote, and, quote, intensely romantic lands, end quote, of novels should serve as, quote, a guidebook to what life holds for a man, end quote. So we have this very romantic ideal, of what life is like, according to Robert Cohn, versus this more cynical post-war, um, almost more factual, real perspective of Jake Barnes and the rest of the men who served in the war. Robert Cohn also feels like he's just on the cusp of a greater life rather than being able to just simply enjoy the present, which many of the other characters and men in the novel do, as we can see by their drinking, as we can see by this kind of carpe diem, devil may care this way attitude with how they enjoy the festival and Paris. Robert Cohn is not like that. And he even talks with Jake at the very beginning of the novel, kind of asking Jake, like, don't you feel like you aren't living your best life? And that it's just passing you by. To which Jake responds, no. But obviously Robert Cohn still has that kind of idea, just like a very romantic, very idealized person that you're always on the cusp. You're always pursuing this, like something greater, some greater emotion to take you away. So I also want to talk briefly about pre-war gender norms. And Professor Martin wrote an essay called Brett Ashley as New Woman in The Sun Also Rises. And she opens her analysis stating that, quote, Brett and Jake emerge as the paradigmatic couple who best represent the shift in perception of gender following World War I, end quote. And she goes through kind of how Brett Ashley imbibes this new woman. But I also want to talk too about what those roles looked like. So pre-war manhood was structured by the man being able to suppress his emotions in order to serve his country, to not fear death or to not think about death as he is fighting in the trenches, because otherwise it will disable him from doing what must be done. So men weren't supposed to be vulnerable, which Martin also poses could be a reason for shell shock, right? This idea that you have to suppress what you're feeling, suppress the emotion in order to get what's done, get what is necessary to get done. And she also says that Barnes, quote, impotence is a sign of loss of masculine power and authority, an axiomatic right to exercise social control, end quote. And because of this loss of masculine power through the ability to have sex, he's the only person that doesn't actually try to possess Brett, making the connection that sex and the ability to have sex is a way in the modern era and just in general, the pre-war era, as a way of controlling women. Likewise, because of this lack of sexual fulfillment, we actually see Barnes not only curse Brett Ashley's name, but also cry alone in his apartment, which is very counter to the idea of male emotional repression. We see him vulnerable, and we see him almost in this understandably self-pitying perspective, which again, men were not supposed to do. We also see that he frequently lets Brett make her own choices, and he actually aids her in those choices, specifically in her relationship with Romero and getting that started, which again goes against commonly accepted norms that the man must make the decisions and must be the leader. And it almost emasculates him according to those pre-war norms because he isn't the one calling the shots. Robert Cohn, on the other hand, is what we would call in today's speech whipped, because and again, it subverts this idea of gender normative masculinity in pre-war world, because he is consistently at the whim of Lady Brett Ashley's desires and emotions. He has allowed his obsession with her to not only control his actions, where he goes, when he goes, but also his emotions. And it subverts his role and his ability to be respected within the rest of the group of men that he spends time with. And he also takes up the stereotypical role of a woman in the idea that sex is an emotional connection and commitment, and that it means something more than just physical fulfillment with no strings attached, which, ironically, on the other hand, that's what Lady Brett Ashley sees it as, right? It's just sex, there's no meaning behind it, which is why she progressively is getting more and more annoyed with him as the story continues. So jumping over to women too, in a pre-war society were supposed to be silent, submissive, and belonged to the private spaces, specifically the home. Those that didn't follow the societal norm were seen as disreputable women. And according to the Victorian ideals, we see that the woman was either a Madonna figure or a fallen woman, without any ability for subtlety in between or options to be defined as anything else. And as mentioned earlier in the presentation, the woman who expatriated to France actually had a bit more freedom in not having the public scrutiny of America, and whether or not they fit into the standards of private, subdued, humble, private space woman. And we see Lady Brett Ashley, especially in Paris, really subverting those norms. Her character is simultaneously married in the process of a divorce, while also being engaged to another man, while also sleeping with Cohn and Romero, and almost leading Jake Barnes along, which completely subverts the norms and also normalizes this idea of the new woman. And it's also challenged by her physical descriptions, right? It's challenged because her title literally says lady, but she does not act like the definition of a lady according to pre-war Victorian standards. She inhabits the flapper role, which automatically shrugs off traditional values. Her hair is cropped. The fact that she wears trousers, that she has a masculine name, and Hemingway gave her a masculine name of Brett rather than, Elizabeth or Sylvia. It's Brett, right? A male name. She she can hold her own, drinking as much liquor as the men. She treats men on her level rather than kind of submitting to them and their ideas and what they want to do. And she even, unlike women were supposed to do, and what fit more of the male role, she initiates her own sexual encounters, which we can see with Cohn and with Romero. And it challenges this quiet Madonna like gender normative that's implied by her title. Likewise, she's also most free within progressive cities like Paris, rather than Pamplona, which still holds is more traditional, not as big of a city, not as fast moving and progressive. And we can see that just simply through when she's trying to celebrate in San Fermin and dance with the men and dance around, the citizens actually don't let her do that and instead put her in this kind of Madonna-like role by putting her in the middle and dancing around her. So she's somebody to be worshipped and revered, not somebody to actually participate in life and in celebration. And we can also see this in Romero's desire of having her grow her hair out because it's more feminine instead of just accepting the fact that her hair is cropped and that's not what she wants to do, and that can still be a feminine thing. So we see both Robert Cohn specifically, or not Robert Cohn, sorry, Jake Barnes and Lady Brett Ashley kind of reversing traditional roles. And we see that throughout the rest of the novel. Now, unfortunately, Lady Brett also seems to be kind of cursed by her own choices, where in the end, one, she seems to choose men that are consistently not great for her, and in the end ends up brokenhearted. Her room is in shambles, which I think really kind of mirrors this idea that so are her emotions, and that she's not as emotionally disconnected as I think she would like to be.